Hi, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. Time for Coffee with PC again. I've got my handy dandy cup of coffee here, Cafe Verona from Starbucks. Enjoying it this morning. I trust you are enjoying your coffee as well, whether it's your first cup or your fifth cup or your 10th cup. Hope it hasn't been that kind of day for you. But it has been an interesting series of weeks here. I think we're going into 5 or 6 weeks now that we haven't met together, and several weeks of doing this, checking in a couple of times a week on Coffee with PC. I'm grateful that you are tuning in, you are joining us, you're commenting, and keep doing that, please. As I mentioned the other day, I'd love to have some questions from you. If there's something that we could cover in this time, a couple times a week, Tuesdays and Fridays when we do it, you have a particular question about something in Scripture or church or doctrine or something, please just put it in the comments or send me an email. Either way, it'd be great just to have some ideas that we can explore further together. Today I wanted to look at probably the most meaningful verses of Scripture to me throughout this period of time we've been dealing with coronavirus, with the COVID-19 pandemic. It just seems to be the new reality in our life, and it's upset a lot of our normal life. And so how do we handle that? And looking very early on, I came across this, I think it was on Twitter. Somebody that I follow on Twitter posted this passage as something that kind of struck them. And if I could remember who it was, I'd certainly give them credit for it, but I couldn't do that this morning. Even looked real quick, couldn't find it because it's been several weeks ago. But it's in the book of 2 Corinthians, and 2 Corinthians chapter 1. Paul is talking about his situation. He's writing to the Christians at the church in Corinth, and boy, he's had a back and forth, up and down relationship with them. But you see in this particular opening chapter, he's talking about kind of a personal thing that he was in a tight spot. He was in a bad place, and he's talking about the things that he's learning, and I think it really applies to us. He says in verse 8 that they were under pressure. It seemed like it was beyond their ability to endure. They despaired for their life. They were afraid in verse 9 that death might be near. I mean, these are things that maybe we feel throughout this period of time when we're having the threat of this virus around us. But then in verse 9 he goes on and he says this. He says, "But this happened," meaning whatever the situation he was undergoing that was that difficult, that caused him to be afraid and pushed to his limit. He said, "But this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead. He has delivered us in the past from deadly peril, and he will deliver us again. On him we have set our hope, that he will continue to deliver us, and you help us by your prayers." So he's writing to his friends that are in Corinth, and he's saying, you're helping me go through this by praying, and we can do that for each other. We've talked about that before, but really that verse 9 is what jumps out to me. This happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead. We're right off of Easter weekend, where we remember the resurrection of Jesus Christ and how meaningful that's kind of the cornerstone of our faith. If Christ is not raised, well, our hope is in vain. We talked about that on Sunday. And so Paul writes this to say that that's so important to him, because here's the thing, even from a pastoral point of view and talking to other pastors going through this through Zoom calls and different meetings of that nature, there's a sense that we who are leaders in the church, we don't know how to handle this. We're not sure what is the right thing to do, or sometimes even the next thing to do. We're just trying to do the best we can, maybe just like you are in your own circumstances. And what has come home to me, and this is kind of on the personal side, is in 20 years here at the church in Key Largo, 20 years as pastor, over 20 years, you get into some rhythms and some habits of life and ministry. And so when things happen, you just kind of fall back on those patterns. You just kind of rely on the things that you've done in the past. Like last year's calendar sets this year's calendar, whether it's Easter activities or anything else. And then something like this happens, and you're like, oh, I can't do what I've done in the past. I can't rely on those familiar programs or habits. And Paul felt that same way. And I love what he says. He says, listen, this happened for a reason. And the reason Paul said he was struggling and facing these things is so that he would learn a lesson, that he would learn to rely less on himself and more on God. And I'm finding that in my own life, that all the time God is pushing us. God is constantly kind of pushing us away from self-reliance. See, because we know some things that we can do pretty well. We kind of have the places that we're comfortable, the things that we're comfortable doing, and as long as we're doing that, we feel pretty confident, we feel pretty in control. But then this comes along and we lose that sense of control and confidence, and we have no choice but to rely on God. And I love what this verse says. It says, you know, you have your resume, but God has his resume too. God says you can rely on yourself or you can rely on me. And I don't know what you can do, but what I can do, God says, is raise the dead. So when we learn to rely on God, we're placing our hands into his hands, the hands that raised Jesus from the dead, that can deal with whatever the pressures that are in our life, that we feel like we've reached our limit. We can no longer endure, and we just can't take the situation anymore. God says, rely on me, learn to rely on me, and I will see you through. And so that's been a verse that I've come back to over and over again these last several weeks as we've been going through this. And I hope I'm learning that lesson, that it's not just about what I can do or the patterns I've built in my life. It's about learning to rely more and more on God every day. And I hope in this situation that we are all in, that maybe you're finding that too. You're finding those places where you've learned God is reliable. You can rely on him, and he takes what seems like even the most difficult and can bring life and hope into it. We need hope right now, and maybe we're getting a little glimmer of things turning, curves flattening. However, we're talking about the topic of reopening our country and our areas is beginning to be talked about, and so while we might get back to some of the things we're used to, we don't want to go back to the normal of just relying on what we can do. We want to use these weeks to learn to rely more on God, who is able to do, as Paul writes in Ephesians, immeasurably more than we could ask or even imagine, according to the power that is at work in us. So this morning, this Friday morning, as you enjoy your coffee, as you get into your day, as the weekend is ahead, I pray that you'll find ways today, specific ways today, where you'll see how God demonstrates that he's reliable and you can trust him. All right, well, we'll check in with you again next week, next Tuesday, Coffee with PC. And of course, Sunday morning, we'll have our worship service, 9 a.m. Hope you can join us then. And again, put those comments in, those questions you might have in the comment section of this video, just so we'll get some ideas for future editions of Coffee with PC. All right, thanks. Take care. Have a great Friday.